Very pleased to have you join us for our introductory session to the Retrofit workshops. My name is Joe Flanagan. I'm the project manager for the Energy House 2 project, and I'm just going to give you a kind of short, brief introduction to what we're going to do, a bit of background to the project. First of all, I'd just like to give you some housekeeping rules. I guess we're all pretty familiar with Zoom by now, but I can ask you to remain on mute. You should have joined in a muted state. If you've got any questions, we welcome questions. If you could enter those via the chat function, and we'll have space a bit later on to address those questions. If you've got any technology issues, just direct message the host, which is Helen, and she will try and sort you out. And finally, we will be recording these. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, get your video off and don't contribute. So anyway, let's go. As I said, I'm project manager for this exciting project. And in terms of background, we at the University of Salford are all about low carbon buildings and retrofit. And about 10 years ago, we conceived the Energy House, and you can see a picture of that in the background. And this is a Victorian terraced house within an environmental chamber. So we've got there the facility to create very controlled, stable conditions, reproducible conditions. We can simulate a great deal of different weather conditions down to -12 up to +30, rain, snow and wind. What that allows us to do, it allows us to give a perfect test bed for any new technologies and building types. So people can test these without the variables that you get in the real world. And, you know, I'm grossly simplifying here, but we can give people an indication of performance of their technology in perhaps 2 or 3 weeks testing in the Energy House. Whereas in the real world, if you're field testing, it probably take 2 years. You'd need 2 heating seasons. So there's obviously a great deal of cost saving and time saving that can be achieved by using the Energy House. However, it's a bit limited. It's a Victorian terraced house. If you've ever visited it, you'll know it's right in the middle of a building. We had to build it brick by brick through corridors, bringing the bricks on wheelbarrows. So we're stuck with this design. We can't very easily change it. We can't knock it down and build a different design of house. Chamber is quite small. There's a nice wide angle lens shot you can see there, but we're a bit constrained on space. So about 4 years ago, we had the idea that we'd like to build something a lot bigger, a lot better, more flexible. And so we conceived the Energy House 2, which you'll hear more about in due course. This is going to be 2 chambers. Each chamber can accommodate up to 2 semi-detached dwellings, 2 detached dwellings. We've got a wider temperature range. We can go from -20 up to +40. So those kind of conditions account for about 95% of the populated area of the world. I say we've got a big temperature range. We've only made this possible because we were very successful in getting a European Union grant. And so we've got £8 million from the European Union to put towards the capital of this facility. It's due to be completed February, March next year. But the grant that we've got from the European Union has also enabled us to carry out quite an extensive business engagement programme. And so we're working with local small and medium-sized companies to help them develop their low carbon technologies. And this series of workshops are part of that business engagement programme. So we will be working extensively over the next sort of 12 months. So if companies have got low carbon technologies, they want some academic expertise, or they want to have access to our facilities to try and further their development, that's all available free of charge. I mean, you can't beat that. So if you're a local SME and you've got some technology, please come and talk to us. Excuse me. So I hope that over the next few weeks, you'll be able to join us on these Tuesday afternoon sessions. The idea is to give people a bit more detail about Retrofit, a bit more detail about the Energy House 2 project. As I say, we'll be opening up in 2022, and I hope I can all meet you in person when things are back to normal, and you can come along to the grand opening. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Will Swan, who is going to give you a little bit more detail about these forthcoming workshops. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. Can everybody see me? My name's Will Swan, and I'm the director of what we call Energy House Labs. So that's Energy House 1, Energy House 2, and the Smart Meters Lab. As Joe said, we've got an extensive sort of outreach program with businesses in Greater Manchester across all sorts of different issues. Me personally, I'm the chair for low carbon buildings for Greater Manchester challenge groups. And so I've been involved in writing the retrofit strategy for Greater Manchester. And I've also been involved in writing the retrofit strategy for Leeds City region as well. And as well as being involved in a number of national retrofit initiatives. So what I'm going to talk about today is it's really very much a taster session, because there's so many people on the call. It's really, you know, there's 70 of you here today, which is, it demonstrates the amount of interest in there. Is really just to give you a taster of how we see retrofits at the moment. So we won't be able to drill into huge amounts of detail because it's only a reasonably short session, but it frames what's coming up next in the sessions that follow. And I think one of the other things we'd really like to take the opportunity to do is perhaps hear from you to say, actually, yeah, we're interested in those sessions, but here are some other things we might be interested as well. So we can make sure that if you have an interest in, say, fabric performance or an interest in modelling, maybe that's something we could pick up and design for you. And I think the one good thing about these sessions, because we've been in this space quite a long time, and is that actually you're getting access to some of the national experts in the field. So, you know, when we're talking about building performance, these are people who are running projects with the government. When we're talking about things like past 2035, these are the people who pulled the standard together. So, you know, I think we're offering a really interesting package of events here, but if you've got things you need, we'd be really, really interested to hear from you. So I'll just share my screen now, and just bear with me a little second. Oh, I've got disabled screen sharing just for the second. Can the host, could you just allow me to screen share? It's always going to happen eventually, isn't it? There we go. That's up to. Okay, just bear with me 1 second. Okay. So you should be able to see my slides in all their glory there. So really, like I said, this is a taster session. So the way the session will work is I'm going to talk about retrofit and some of the things that we've done for maybe half an hour. We'll have a short Q&A session, so people can sort of pick me up on any of the issues or any of the other areas. And then myself and Nigel Blanford will just give a very brief taster of the 4 sessions that we're going to be running after this event. And those sessions are obviously a lot more detailed. This session's only just over an hour. And actually, after those 4 taster sessions, we'll have another quick Q&A. And I think that's the point where people go, oh, do you know what? I would be interested in this session, that session. We'd really like to hear from you on that. And obviously, you can follow up with us in terms of contact after the event if there's other things that you're interested in. So I think one of the things that's difficult about retrofit, and we've been around it for 10 years plus, and you know, I think we've seen as if not more failures than successes. You know, we think of things like the Green Deal, all those installs that have been unsuccessful, but we still see it as an essential part of policy. So I'm going to touch on some of the reasons and some of the reasons that are quite complex and make it difficult to do. I think in terms of framing it, we're going to define actually what we think retrofit is, and actually how it's changed over the last 10 years, because there's a lot of things technologically that have changed for us. Certainly when we started out, we were researching one set of problems, and now we're researching a new set of problems. How do we do retrofit? What are some of the standards? What are some of the processes that we need to think about when we're delivering retrofit? And probably the most important question, and it's the one, you know, that excises policymakers more than in some respects the technical issues, is the funding models. So I'm just going to touch on a few of those and just talk about some of the ideas that people have about how we're going to pay for it. And I'm going to touch on what policy needs to look like, because one of the things we have seen, you know, we did some policy advisory with BEIS, where we basically said, don't drop a load of money on the problem because that will just make more problems. And you've noticed that you've seen the withdrawal of the Green Homes Grant in its current form. So we're going to talk about some of the things, particularly in Greater Manchester, but in some other city regions as well, looking at ways they're going to try and deliver retrofit, because it is a complicated thing to do. But if we're going to hit some of the targets that we're setting ourselves, it's essential. The first one's easy. Climate change mitigation. So, we've seen the energy white paper come out, and buildings there are a big part of that decarbonisation story. It's 17% emissions from heating and cooling. So without addressing the building stock, and particularly domestic heating, we're not going to get anywhere near the targets. And if we think, 2050 is a national target, 2038 for Greater Manchester, and some other cities are being even more ambitious. I think Newcastle is 2030. So that climate change mitigation is a really important issue, but also potentially we need to be thinking not only about mitigation, but a retrofit that is adaptive as well to potential climate change. I think the second reason, and probably where a lot of this started, is fuel poverty. We can see the numbers are creeping down, but quite often that relates to mild winters. So when we first started doing a piece of work in around 2012, it was a very, very long winter, and fuel poverty was rife because people were actually heating into May, when normally we would expect the heating season to end a couple of months earlier. And actually fuel poverty was a big reason why we started doing the work. It probably because it's more immediate than climate change in some respects. And it links to health, which is another issue that we're going to raise. But actually, when you see people choosing between heating and eating, it's an immediate problem. But it doesn't necessarily get answered in the same way as climate change mitigation. There is a relationship between those two approaches, but it can lead to different outcomes and different choices. Number three, and this is related directly to fuel poverty, is around comfort and health. It's a big issue. BRE, I mean, this probably needs updating because it's a major problem, but BRE identified that 1.4 billion in NHS costs were associated with poor housing. And that relates to the Marmot report on health inequalities as well. So I think the reason to retrofit, we see these things like boiler on prescription. If you look at places like Oldham, their clinical commissioning group has offered out retrofit solutions to improve people's health outcomes, because actually people in comfortable homes, particularly with chronic illnesses, quite often present less at hospitals, and so the associated cost of not having a doctor can quickly cover the cost of a retrofit improvement. I think the other thing that we're starting to see now as well is it's not only low temperatures. So we need to start thinking about overheating. And actually it's this balance between, insulating for energy efficiency, but making sure that the building still performs. Number four, and this is a big one for it very much, if you sort of go back maybe 10 years ago, this was kind of a very much a third wheel of the energy policy. But actually, the electrification of heat and transport that we're starting to see, and the change in the energy system, means that retrofit is different and also has a big role to play in the way that we consume energy. And I'll touch on that in terms of projects that we've done a little bit later. Okay, and retrofit, basically, I think it can be lots of different things and done in lots of different ways. But really, when we retrofit, we're looking at reducing conduction and convection losses. So, improving the insulation, improving the air tightness of the property. We're looking at the efficiency of the systems that we put in place to heat and cool, and we look at control. Now, we tend not to deal with people, but we need to put people at the center of this, because actually, they can scupper a retrofit with things they call the rebound effect, where people claim comfort back, but they can also scupper it by not being able to use the technological solutions that we give them. So we really need to think hard about, actually, this is a person's home. It is not a technical solve in its entirety. It is about giving something that people can live with. Now, this is quite a simplistic view of retrofit, and probably one that maybe is starting to become a little bit out of date. But fundamentally, you know, when we think about reducing the energy consumption of a property, these are kind of the 4 areas that we focus on. And this was the model that we were working to. And to some extent exists very broadly now. You know, more than 85% of people are on gas, or they're on oil. You know, for people who are off gas, they're quite often on oil, they're on a fossil fuel. And it's a very simple consumer model. Energy goes in and the house is a consumption node at the end of the gas and electricity network. And so really, that's why we had that energy efficiency model for retrofit, because it was about just minimizing that load on that node for the consumer. And if you do that in terms of gas and electricity, you reduce the climate change, the carbon dioxide emissions, and you improve fuel poverty. But this model is, you know, it's a relatively simple and straightforward one. So there are a number of sort of key concepts that were sort of floating around if you sort of go back maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So fabric first, and the use of energy hierarchies, which was about making the fabric as efficient as possible before you started adding renewables or greenwash or things like that. So it's a really interesting concept in terms of how do you choose what to do? And we have things like now, sort of no regrets improvements as well. Issues around deep retrofit. So what qualifies as a retrofit? So, you know, there is this argument as to how deep do we go to a property in one hit and do something like a deep retrofit where we look to reduce energy consumption by sort of 50% or more, or get it down to a certain amount of watts, you know, watts per meter squared per year. And so models such as Retrofit, which is the passive house retrofit standard, sort of take us in that direction. And then there are other issues more pragmatically around how do we go about retrofit? Because even early on, when we talk about people, it's people's unwillingness to engage with retrofit. They find it disruptive, it's inconvenient. So how do we encourage retrofit to happen? So one of the things around that was trigger events. So looking at other issues, such as going on to fix a roof as an opportunity, not boring, yeah, am I, Nigel? Going on to roofs and installing solar panels. Another important issue is performance gap as well, because I think the other thing that we relied on very heavily in retrofit, certainly around the time of the Green Deal or the early energy company obligations, such as the carbon emissions reduction target and the Communities Energy Savings Programme, is we relied on RD-SAP and SAP, so the regulatory models to understand how buildings would perform after we'd retrofit them. And what we found when we actually went to measure them, and that was something that's very much our bread and butter, is there was always a big gap between how we thought they would perform and how they actually performed. And a lot of that is to do with the different ways in which we organise the construction, the way things are installed, and our actual understanding of the performance of products. And these are some of the reasons here. So, you know, things like thermal bridging. I think that's the energy house with a lovely big thermal bridge. So where there are weak points in the fabric where conduction can occur, thermal bridging is not only an energy efficiency issue, it's a building pathology issue as well, because it can create what we call hygrothermal risk, so patches of black mold and condensation, because the surface temperature is just that bit colder in the house and water will condense there. So, and really, when we think about those kinds of risks, those are some of the biggest problems that we saw in the early retrofits, particularly when we started going to scale. And some of that's about under design and not really thinking through properly how things were put together. Another issue is things that just like the organization of the work. So putting a load of insulation in and then drilling a bunch of holes through it, by its very nature, means that the building will perform less efficiently. And then also issues around end user risks around underheating, So they can all create issues. And a lot of these are driven by, design and quality. And I'll touch on how some of these things are addressed. Oh, sorry, I skipped on a little bit. So just to sort of go back to this type of solution that we were talking about, one of the projects we did in the Energy House, so you can see that Joe was virtually sitting in front of a while ago, was with a company called Saint-Gobain. A lot of people haven't heard of Saint-Gobain, but they are one of the biggest, the biggest construction products manufacturer in the world. And so what we did with the property is we did a full retrofit. So we had solid wall insulation on the gable end and the rear of the property, internal wall insulation on the front of the property. We topped up the loft insulation. We improved the glazing in the door, and we put a membrane and insulation in the suspended floor. And then the one thing we did do, which Energy House allows us to do, is we took each of one improvement off at a time, so we could see the impact of each of those individual improvements. And actually, this is one of the things this showed us, was that actually you could do a staged retrofit. You didn't necessarily have to go deep if the money wasn't available. And we estimated the cost of this at the time, so we're looking at 8 years ago now, was around £14,000 to £15,000. So one of the things that we did then was, obviously we measured this to death. And you can actually see there, we had 54 million bits of data collected during the life of the project. And what you can see there is obviously solid wall insulation makes a huge difference. The floor upgrade was actually quite an unexpected one, because it actually reduced the air leakage by a large degree and saved 11%. But it was quite disruptive. And the replacement glazing was actually, because there's actually quite a lot of glazing in the property, with a big bay window and windows to the rear and the doors as well. What this actually also showed us was the average energy saving. So we reduced the heating by about 63%. The actual energy saving at the time was £348 a year. So against £15,000, you can actually see that this type of, and we would say a 63% reduction in heating energy would be a deep retrofit, is not really going to pay for itself in a pure kind of Green Deal view of the world. But what we actually got was, I would say, we improved the visual visual nature of the asset. Comfort was much higher, but then also that we had unintended consequences, that actually the boiler and heating system were then massively oversized. And so we were getting overheating problems. And I think what was really interesting about that is that it made us really think about houses as a whole system. And that's how we have to think. We cannot decouple different elements of retrofit from each other. So this brings us on to the next phase, and I think where we are now, we're in the smart energy systems phase. Around a couple of years ago, we did some work with the Challenger Energy Company, and we were looking at the types of issues that we're starting to think about now, which is really new ways of heating and cooling, different energy vectors, and when I mean different energy vectors, moving away from gas to electricity to hydrogen, district heating, greater use of renewables, increased use of storage. And when I say energy storage, we really think about batteries, but we also think about hot water storage, EV, smart controls. So we did some of the early work on smart controls. There was if you go back sort of maybe 5 years ago, virtually every project that came into the Energy House in 1 year was around smart controls. And the other thing we were very early engaged with is the smart meter infrastructure. So one of the sessions that we'll be talking about relates to the work we've done in our smart meters lab, because actually we see smart meters as not just a way to show you how much energy you're using through your in-home display, but actually it has the potential to weave all these systems together in an interesting way. So if you actually look at what's there at the moment, so that's the Energy House. We built a very quick demonstrator for a project where we had an air source heat pump. So you can see the air source heat pump on the right-hand side, a Tesla Powerwall, a Nissan Leaf, which was used as a battery. So it did vehicle to grid and vehicle to home, and a Mixergy tank, which is basically a sort of what they call a smart hot water cylinder, which operates like a battery. So those types of products not only are coming into the home, but that they're also working towards being interconnected. And this brings us to a new model. So energy efficiency is part of a bigger picture. And what we have now is, rather than these passive consumption nodes, so these little houses sitting on the end just gobbling up gas and electricity, we have houses that can generate, consume, store, and trade energy. And to some extent, what we're kind of seeing is there's an opportunity there to support a domestic retrofit by generating extra income, and I'll touch on how that's done just later on in the presentation. But what we see is we're moving away from fossil fuels to sort of electricity, and obviously renewable electricity, hydrogen, which we won't talk about because we're kind of feeling it's a little bit far away just yet. And obviously district heating using low carbon heating. So the two we're kind of looking at the moment, really electricity and district heating, but hydrogen is going to be around the corner. So what that new model means is those integrated assets can work together to operate in a different way, and really looking at how these assets work together. And this was actually quite a difficult project to do, because none of these assets are optimized to work together. They're optimized for themselves. And if anybody ever wants to hang on to Tesla's help desk for a while to ask them how to talk to their battery, you'll have a long wait. The Nissan Leaf used to shut down every half hour, so we had to get a researcher to climb in and open the doors to make sure the battery could be accessed. So it creates some issues, but as we move on, that integration piece is starting to occur, and we're already starting to see heat pumps, batteries, and PV working together in an optimized way. And that integrates with things like variable tariffs. So we know about Octopus's agile tariff and their integration of electric vehicles into these systems. And there are other trading opportunities such as demand side response, peer-to-peer, and network services. I won't go into a lot of detail here because obviously we've got a limited amount of time. But really, that's about how an individual property then interrelates with the grid. And we're really starting to see that turning into interesting business models, and how that might be used to underpin some of the fabric systems, some of the other issues around trying to get retrofit rolled out. So really, this is what we're seeing is the future of domestic systems are smart controls, Internet of Things, sensor infrastructures, smart meter infrastructure, data analytics, asking the question, of your assets. Can you minimize my carbon footprint? Can you minimize my bill? Can you minimize my reliance on the grid? You can ask reasonably complex questions of your system. That's what will be happening, is it operating as a complex dynamic system. But we know enough about how difficult it can be to make things work that at the moment I think that there is an offer out there, but there's still emerging offers. And actually, where is the consumer in all this? Because the work we did with Good Energy showed that you could actually generate around £400 for the consumer a year. But actually, who's looking out for the consumer and who's protecting them to make sure that reverts to them? I think another issue that isn't really well thought through, I think we all run around going, oh, let's retrofit everything, but who actually wants it? Who are they? Who do they value it? And I think the issue is certainly with the owner-occupier market. I think in social housing, we're dealing with asset managers, and they're retrofitting. They have a long view about their whole asset. They have boiler replacements. They'll replace it with an air source heat pump. But actually, that's only a fraction of the market. We've got the private rented sector and a lot of small landlords in some cases. And we've also got, still a decent number of owner occupiers. And I think one of the questions that we've been failing to ask is actually, how do those break down and what do they want? And I think we did a piece of work in Greater Manchester, where the Energy Systems Catapult conducted a survey of around 2,000 people. And they felt that they'd identified around 30%, I think it was about 31% of people, would be ready to move with some form of retrofit, but not necessarily a deep retrofit. So there was a driver there to do retrofit, but while some people would definitely get their carbon down as low as possible, other people were saying, maybe I'll spend £5,000 to £10,000 on insulation or a new heating system. So we need to understand that better. And I think on the flip side of that, and certainly one of the areas that we're definitely working in Greater Manchester is how do people know if they want it, where to get it from, and how can we have trusted providers? So this is an interesting question. And again, it's something that, if you're going to enter into a business around retrofit, it can't just be about the funding if it's a long-term business, because the funding streams have been quite unpredictable. It's about understanding and building a market. And I think to some extent, that's why the Green Homes Grant has been pulled back, because there's a lot more market making to do at the moment. Delivering retrofit, everybody's favorite, past 2035. So, and I'll touch a little bit more on the session later on. So delivering retrofit is, what are the stages that we need to think about? What are the standards and what are the roles? Is the industry, as the small construction industry, particularly in the owner occupier market, really geared up to deliver this? And so past 2035 sets out a standard, and I won't go into this too much because I'll touch on it a little bit later. But part of that is assessment, so how do we survey? How do we understand the risks? How do we understand how things are being used? And what we're seeing, and this relates again to another session I'll be talking about a little bit more, is there is actually an increasing number of tools available for us to understand properties. So, infrared, and actually, there's some work in quantitative infrared. So you can actually get things like the measured performance of walls using infrared tools, and SMETA's there using smart meter data and temperature data to understand what the fabric performance is of a property. So as well as traditional surveying, actually there are other tools there to help us understand what we need to do to a property, and where are the properties that we really need to intervene with. Specification and design, so what's the retrofit strategy and what are the modeling tools that are available to us? I think specification is becoming increasingly complex, because understanding what different users need and what different budgets are, and where certain things like batteries, storage and energy trading can be applied is becoming increasingly difficult. In some respects, the previous energy efficiency model was easier to deal with. So specification and design is always the one, and certainly with the Green Deal, was the one that we kind of missed out, which led to some of the problems. We under-design things quite a lot. So this is another area that we may pick up in a future workshop. Delivery, and again, this goes definitely back to past 2035. Quality, selecting the right products and systems for the type of property that you've got. How do you coordinate with multiple trades? How do you manage those projects? What are the common issues in terms of delivering retrofit? What are the learnings that we can take away? And issues around detailing. And there's a really good, for those of you who are interested in detailing, there's a really good service online called retrofit.support, which is called the Retrofit Pattern Book, which has a series of details for common archetypes, a lot of them in Greater Manchester. Funding is another interesting one. For those of you who've ever worked in retrofit at the funding side of things, the last decade has just been an absolute nightmare. We've had CERT, CESP, the Green Deal. When we launched Energy House 1, the minister responsible for the Green Deal said he would resign if he hadn't done X tens of thousands of Green Deals. And I think we ended up with a few hundred by the end of it. But there is a lot of money coming out there, a lot of it going into social housing for market making, but there is more stuff happening. What's probably more interesting is that there are business models that people are interested in now. So actually, I can't recommend this report enough. Actually, the Green Finance Institute are really looking at different models for funding retrofit around energy services, equity loans, things like equity release, green bonds, revolving loan funds, performance guarantees, and heat as a service, those kinds of things, like Energy Sprong, where they basically the retrofit is paid for, but you have a very specific energy plan with that provider. But that's an excellent resource, the financing energy efficient buildings. And what they're doing, so that's their introductory report, what they're doing is taking these forward and working with things like mortgage providers and warranty providers to actually make these things more watertight and better for the consumer. So really, I think the thing is that we have to understand, this is a slide that was presented to BEIS last year, that actually retrofit's reasonably complex. There are a lot of things that can go wrong, but there are a lot of new things and tools that are available out there, which is why we kind of thought, you know, this is something that we wanted to do as part of the Energy House 2 project, which was really about making people aware of the things that are going on nationally, things that the experts are doing, what's emerging. So just to sort of touch base, it's doing the right thing. So having the assessment tools, process tools, the guidance, where's all that signposting? So making sure that we're doing the thing that is right for the property and more importantly, right for the customer. Doing it well. Are we installing? Do we have quality? Do we have the skills? And some of these things, you know, are about individual businesses. Some of these things are about policy, and some of these things are about universities providing skills. I think the other thing is if we don't have the money in place, nobody's going to move anywhere. So even if you have a demand, you're not, and even if you have supply, you're not going to get anywhere without different kinds of funding models. You know, so there's the network services and demand side response as an opportunity, but also things like equity release and green mortgages are there. So there's more drivers there coming. And I think the other side of that is actually when we do it well, making sure that we validate what we're doing. So actually having models, but also using the opportunities of new technologies, particularly IoT and smart meters, about understanding how retrofits are actually performing. Quite often we don't do a lot of measurement and validation afterwards. And so the prices are falling. I think the other thing is just about surveying practice as well, about building surveyors and domestic energy assessors understanding what they're looking at. So it's not all technology fixes. And then I think the other thing is about sustained demand. So I think one of the risks that people, when they've entered into the market, and particularly around Green Deal, you know, they invest in building a supply chain and getting themselves going. We have to have sustained demand. And some of that's about the government building early pipeline, but actually having an ongoing market that is built over a period of years. And one of the recommendations we made is, you know, you can't just drop 2 years worth of money. This is a sort of 5 to 10 year project whereby people then understand that retrofit is something that they can potentially do to their properties. So I'll just stop there. I'll take a few questions. If there's a few chats there in the box. Joe, is there anything that is it all just abuse?
No, it's not all just abuse.
It's most of it.
Quite a few comments around retrofit, around the lack of skills and contractors probably not actually doing what they said they would do. A big issue in terms of probably the performance gap.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and you know, that with my role in Greater Manchester, the things that we are looking at are things like skills. And in some respects, the problem is that everything has to move at the same time. You have to have the skills, you have to have the demand, you have to have the supply, you have to have the finances all kind of lined up. And what we've really got now is a fair amount of market failure. And actually the skills, you know, a lot of them are fairly traditional skills about measuring, cutting, installing things properly, following the manufacturer's guidelines. And to some extent, we've been, the victims of our own sort of policy structures whereby we've charged people, by the square meter rather than trying to get the job done correctly. But skills is very much on the horizon. I think it's, one area of building back better and post-COVID recovery is the government sees actually building, towards retrofit is one of those ways through it. But it can't be done without all those things all done at the same time. Any more questions, comments?
Somebody's asked about heat pumps. Sorry, I've lost the question. Yeah, issue around lack of skills to maintain heat pumps. So, how can we?
So I would say if we went back, I think there's a really good study by the Energy Saving Trust called the Heat Pump Trials. And I think it's going back quite a few years, probably maybe more than 10 years, that I think at the time they said 70% of heat pumps that were going in were either incorrectly specified, incorrectly fitted, or incorrectly used. It was a big problem. I think some of the issues are going away as heat pumps become more prevalent, but I think the issue is, we're very much addicted to gas, which is relatively cheap. If you go into the continent, heat pumps are much more prevalent. And as they become more prevalent, then the supply chains will come in behind them. I think some of the issues we're seeing with heat pumps, particularly at scale, are around connections to the grid, but that's improving. Issues around planning and acoustics, but also the skills issue is another issue, is an issue that needs addressing. One of the things we're doing in Greater Manchester is a thing called the Heat Pump Accelerator. So that's a group of installers, social housing providers, private developers, skills organisations, to try and find a way to sort of improve the uptake of heat pumps, but also improve the outcomes for those people who have heat pumps and understand, when they should go in, how they're going to be maintained. So yeah, it's definitely an important issue.
And I guess just before we move on to Nigel, somebody's just asked whether we're planning to share the slides or the video after each webinar. Yes, we will be probably putting them on YouTube. It may take us a few days, so don't expect to see it immediately, but we'll share the links when they're up and available.
Okay, so do you want to go next, Nigel, and then I'll do my slides after?
Yeah, could do that if you want.
People will be sick by now, I should imagine. Cheers.
Just bear with me. Oh, slight technical issue here. The menu's in the way.
Nigel, if you just go to the bottom of your slides, this looks like a TV screen to the right.
Yeah,
if you double click that twice.
There we go. Great, thank you very much. So yeah, my name's Nigel Blanford. I'm going to give you a brief overview. So this next sort of session that me and will be doing will be a brief outline of every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, we'll have a short session on a different subject. And on the 4th of May, this isn't running in the order that we were originally going to do it, but on the 4th of May, between 1 and 4, there'll be a session on low carbon heating, and that will be hosted by myself. So this is basically giving you a brief overview to see whether this is the kind of session that you'll want to pop into, and hopefully you will do. So as sort of you all know, it's all about sort of fabric first, but there is the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is heating. And if you have a look here again, this is something that Will's already shared. 37%, the largest sector of emissions in 2016 by sector is coming from heat. And if we then drill down into that, this is a slightly different data set, but fuel consumption for heat in 2017, you can see within that heat sector, almost half of it, 43%, is coming from domestic space heating. So that is your elephant in the room. And what the reasons you've got there. Again, Will's touched on this gas issue. Here's a graph, first half of 2020 of European countries and the price of gas per kilowatt hour. There's the UK there highlighted. We put a little line across there. That's level with Belgium. So everything mainly to the left of that is Western European countries. Everything between Belgium and the UK on there is Eastern European countries. So you can see that we've got quite cheap gas. And on this chart, it works out at 4.3 pence a kilowatt hour. But I mean, I pulled this off the web the other week, 2.8 pence a kilowatt hour. I think I'm paying about 3p at home. So yeah, we've got really, really, really cheap gas here. And that's part of the issue. And if you look at how the UK has done very well globally in reducing its carbon emissions, it's done this by, the dash for gas, they call it. And, we've done well to date, but if we want to make any more carbon savings, then we're really hitting the brick wall here if we stick with this sort of gas heating, I guess. Government policy is quite clear about the direction that we need to go, and that direction is electrification of heating. So this whole session on low carbon heating. So the first bit will be a small introduction by me. There'll be an overview on heat pumps generally. That will be given by Nathan Van Gablin. Nathan is well known to a lot of you out there. He's also the winner of the Renewable Energy Association's Communications Award this year. So he's a man in demand. And that's a general overview, but then we've got more detailed sessions on air source, and that's case studies. And that's being given by Dave Kemp, who is quite well known in Greater Manchester, and the social housing side, deploying heat pumps into the social housing scene. So that's a lot of interesting information there on deploying air source heat pumps in Manchester, and some of the issues and some of the opportunities they found. With regard to ground source case studies, we've got Andy Louth. So Andy runs Groundtherm, one of the very early ground source heat pump companies, and they're based in Greater Manchester, or just the south of Greater Manchester. And Andy's been very influential within the Ground Source Heat Pump Association. So I can tell you a bit more with case studies about when it might be appropriate and when it's not appropriate to use ground source heat pumps. And then the other thing, and we talked about electrification of the heat, the other area the government is keen on is heat networks. And we'll have a talk from Gemma Dyson and Glenn Harrison from Vital Energy on heat networks. And that will include also about the whole thing with regards to how you charge for it on an individual basis, meter payments, etc., as well as the sort of the physicalities of heat interface units into properties from the heat network. And then the final bit is will be me, unfortunately, and I'll be doing the mopping up. Be talking a little bit about biomass, because that's an area that I like talking about. I like burning stuff. A little bit about solar thermal and green gases. So this was touched upon by Will, particularly on the hydrogen side there. So while, like I said, it's very early days, and if it's going in that direction, we don't know. The government, like I said, are still pushing for the electrification, but the gas network out there have got a lot of money invested in the ground in physical infrastructure. Will this end up between a fight? Will it be electricity versus green gases? I don't know. Will we end up with those people that are old enough, a situation where it's going to be Betamax or VHS? Who knows? Who knows? But whatever it is, we know that there's a tough hill to climb for electrification there. 23 million residential buildings, or 8% of households connected to the gas network. The domestic RHI was seeing around 100,000 air source heat pumps installed each year, yet the government is looking to have 600,000 heat pumps a year installed by 2028. So yeah, tough hill to climb. So what we'd want to know, and the discussion is, what are going to be the bigger carrots and what are going to be the bigger sticks in low carbon heating to make this policy change happen. Like I'm saying, that will be on the 4th of May. So just going to switch over now, just to another, go back to sharing again. Sorry about this, I'm not particularly wonderful with technology, but here we go, that's the next one. So the last session, and I know there's been questions already in the chat box about this, about sort of the smart controls and smart systems. This is run by Yanis Paraskevas, and this session is like, I guess Will said, is like, we've done a lot of work in the traditional retrofit of the university, and this is the area that we see is really rapidly expanding. I find it really interesting. You know, you see a lot of great stuff coming out in this area. So yeah, it's moving away from the sort of traditional sort of retrofit into you know, away from what we've been doing and away from the heating things, and we're beginning to look at smart homes. And this is about both the hardware and the software, and it's about saving of carbon and money. So it's also about how that home, and Will said at the end, is not looking at this in a silo, but how it connects to the wider world. And a lot of that is to do with the Internet of Things, which will be touched on. So like I'm saying, Yanis will be heading this up, and he is the lead for the Smart Meters, Smart Homes Research and Innovation Laboratory. And this is based at Jewel House. You can see a picture up there in the right-hand side there. That's where I'm housed at the moment, in one of those windows, probably above that little arch there. And I know about heating because it's absolutely freezing in here at the moment. But within there, and this is the actual place where James Prescott Jewell lived and done a lot of his research, within here we have the lab looking at smart metering and also smart devices, and a lot of research is done on pattern recognition and integrating this whole thing into the smart homes ecosystem. So I'll be giving a little introduction there very briefly, because I've done work with the district network operator on the electricity network, and like I'm saying, it's sort of smart metering as well. And then we have a session from Carolus, who will be talking about time of use tariffs and how this can be integrated with heat pumps. Really interesting piece of sort of integration between, like saying, the time of use tariff, heat meters, and some hardware to slightly overheat the property when prices are low, and slightly underheat it when prices are high, but still have that sort of comfort for people within the property. We've got Matt Roderick from Wonderwall, who will be talking about sensors, putting a lot more sensors in the property for both the control of heating, but also integrating that with generation within the property. And finally, we've got Jose Figueiredo, I think I pronounced his name correctly, and he'll be coming all the way from Lisbon, again, looking at sensors in the home and how the consumer can control these, whether it's from a simple light bulb or all the way through to the washing machine. And this is looking into the future. And like I say, this is, I find this really quite exciting. You know, I come from a sort of a low carbon heat background, but I find this whole sort of things with the Internet of Things and smart metering really, really, really interesting. And I hope you do too. So I'm saying that's on Tuesday, the 11th of May, between 1 and 6 o'clock, 1 and 4 o'clock, sorry. And that's it. So Will, I will hand over to you. Will, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Just to say, my slides are not quite as high quality as Nigel's. I'll be covering the other two workshops. The first of them, when we're talking about performance gap, is around building performance. I think this is an area that we seem to know virtually everybody that's doing work in this space. And there's not enough of us to really understand how buildings perform. And so we're seeing a lot of change. If we go back 10 years, it was all fairly standard. There are a lot of new ways in terms of collecting data, in terms of analysing and interpreting that data, that are giving us new ways of doing things faster, cheaper, and that helps us understand, how we need to retrofit, but also once we've retrofit, what is the quality of that retrofit. So the first person obviously is our own Dr. Richard Fitton, who will give us a broad introduction to some of the, the existing standards, but some of the emerging standards as well. The second speaker is Luke Smith from Build Test Solutions, and they deal with innovation in building performance. So, rapid air test, the pulse air test, and some of those types of products. The next speaker is Ross Holleran, and he is a member, works for an organisation called the Building Performance Network, which was established a few years ago to try and raise the standard in understanding and delivering building performance. And the last speaker is Tom Fenton, who has a product called VeryTherm, which we think is really interesting. It was tested in the Energy House recently, and it's a really interesting way of understanding the performance of a building. So just to, I'll just click, right, bear with me a sec. So Build Test Solutions, we can see some of the tools that they've developed. So 3D infrared mapping of heat loss and U values. So actually that's some of that quantitative IR that we were talking about. The pulse test, which is doing an air test, which normally takes about 45 minutes, but doing it in a fraction of the time. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. And energy rating of buildings using smart meter equipment. So using the energy consumption data from smart meters and tying it together with other data to understand the measured performance of the convection and conduction losses of a building. VeryTherm. So this is a product that's been around for a while, and it's actually really being used for validation of new build at the moment, but it can be used for pre and post retrofit measurement. And they've done a lot of testing and field trialing, and there's some really interesting results that they've got. So that'll be Tom Fenton. And then the next speaker will be Ross Holleran from Building Performance, which is to try and understand how we can integrate building performance into part of business as usual for retrofit, because I think it's really, really important in terms of understanding quality about actually getting building performance into a business as usual model. So making it part of the process in terms of assessing the property. And that takes us on to actually, which is the next event, which is understanding past 2035. So past 2035, something we've been involved with really. So it sort of came out the back of the Bonfield review, where it was sort of the round of retrofit we were looking at, sort of in the sort of 10s. Now we're in the 20s. And to try and understand what were the issues where some of the retrofits did not work as well as we wanted them to. And some of them aren't necessarily technical. Some of them are about the process. So the speakers there are David Pierpoint, who's going to look at an introduction to past 2035 and look at the retrofit coordinator specifically. Richard, again, who does training on retrofit assessors, so he's going to introduce that. And then Jonathan Atkinson, who works for Carbon Co-op in Manchester, so some of you may be familiar with him, who's looking at, I suppose, retrofit advisor role and how you work with retrofit customers. And actually, it's like any building customer, but in some respects, it's even more complex. And Carbon Co-op have got a lot of experience of working with customers on deep retrofit. So Each Home Counts, which was the Bonfield review, recognised the need for quality systems. And so Trustmark are part of the story in terms of having assessor schemes and installer schemes. Past 2035 is essentially a code of practice, and they're working towards a British standard at the moment, as well as national occupational standards. So looking at how we pull those standards and procedures together and those qualifications together are an essential part of the skills issue that we really need to think about. And we can see what happens when we don't do things properly. So these are a classic. So you can see there we were talking about poor insulation and condensation, and so by not doing these things properly actually has real implications for homeowners. And it really is about the way that we design things and the way that we manage the construction process. And yeah, you can see the workarounds. I think you're all probably familiar with these kinds of things. So David will be really breaking down the whole process for you in terms of past 2035, but also past 2030 on the installer side of things. And to just give you an understanding of the different sessions. I mean, if you want to do full past 2035, it takes a lot longer, but it gives you that kind of way in to understand what you need to ask for in terms of if you're going to do past 2035, or if you're going to commission somebody to do some work. And the other thing is to understand the different roles, and we can see, you know, some of these roles are conflated, but it also see what type of role, if you have a particular business that's looking to get into retrofit, where you might fit in. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about the process, because the past 2035 will be the embedded standard, and particularly for things like funding and grant funding. So understanding actually how you could have a business model that responds to past 2035 is a useful conversation to have. And we can see, you know, who does what in the process. So that's another area that David will be touching on, which is to really understand the process and to see the different roles and how they come together. And we see that, you know, the retrofit coordinator is kind of the overarching role that fits across all of the processes. And you can also see there, when we talked about building performance, the evaluator, and actually what does that evaluator look like and do. So yeah, I mean, the Retrofit Academy is really sort of the main deliverer of retrofit coordinator work. And they were very closely involved with the development of the standard. So, you know, Dave's a national expert, and you know, we're really grateful that he's taken the time to curate the event, because obviously he'll be working with Jonathan and Richard, but also, you know, drive and structure the event for that day. So that really brings us to an end. So what we've got a few minutes left for questions and answers. But also, if people have ideas, because obviously we talked about quite a few different things here, if people have ideas about other areas that they would like us to explore in terms of curating other workshops and seminars, we'd be really interested to hear that now. And then we can kind of go away and have a little look at what we think, you know, who we think would be good speakers. So, Joe, do you want to just have a quick look through the chat, or so if I stop?
There's been quite an amount of traffic there. Questions about the comments really about the importance of social landlords and how grant rules kind of skew things, tail wagging the dog effect, and we don't end up with what we really wanted with. And somebody interestingly has asked about how Brexit will impact on future EU funding. Well, it won't be there.
There is actually, they're looking at at the moment things like to replace the types of funding for these kinds of things. So where we're funded is European Regional Development Fund. There's been some short-term funding just come out called the Community Renewal Fund. And that will become the Shared Prosperity Fund. So these types of activities, and actually European Regional Development Funding, a lot of it was used to drive retrofit. There's actually a large project funded from a similar pot from Europe called Homes as Energy Systems, which David Kemp's leading. And that looks at the benefits of tying retrofit with smart homes, so batteries, photovoltaics and heat pumps. Okay.
Yeah, I think that just about covers it. I put in the chat our website, so if anybody wants to contact us outside these sessions, there's contact details there on our website. So please do. We encourage dialogue, and we're really keen to talk to anybody who's got bright ideas who wants to know a bit more.
Yeah, and can I say that particularly sort of targeted at the businesses in GM who are working in this space, we definitely want to hear from you. You know, if there's something that you'd like to explore more with us individually, or you have a product, or there are different training sessions, or you want to speak to us one-to-one, definitely, you know, get in touch with Joe or myself, because actually that's kind of why we're here. And I'm, you know, what's been really gratifying is to see actually, you know, the number of people that have come. There's actually nearly everybody who booked has appeared. So if there are any, could we look at consumer behaviour? I'm sure I could get some experts together on consumer behaviour. I'll make a note of that. We'll have a look and see what the demand might be, but actually understanding consumers is, for me, it's a big gap. Will there be any networking opportunities? I'm just sorry, I'll take over now, Joe. What we're hoping to do is when we get to a bit further out of lockdown, because we've obviously got big facilities that people will probably want to come and see, we'll create an opportunity for maybe people to come on site and do some face-to-face networking, because I think we could all do with it, to be honest. So yeah, I've just booked my jabs today, so hopefully we'll be in a situation where we can get everybody together, because actually some of the things, when we bring companies together, that's where a lot of opportunities come for businesses, not just dealing with us but dealing with each other. And you know, Carolis is a great example. He was one of our first companies that we worked with, and then he got bought out by another company that we worked with outside of a professional end, and so he's kind of benefited from that engagement with the wider network. Okay, are there any more questions to anyone? All right, thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.